Snow fell over Shoshone National Forest like a closing curtain, thick enough to swallow headlights and sound alike. The world had narrowed to white and wind, and the steady crunch of boots pressing into drifts that reached past the ankle. Talia Mercer kept her head down against the sting. Her breath came in short clouds that vanished as quickly as they formed. Beside her, Goliath moved with heavy purpose, his broad chest cutting a path through powder that tried to claim every step. This was not heroism, it was habit. Walk the dog, clear the mind. Go back to the trailer before Juniper woke and asked for pancakes she could barely afford to make. The forest answered only with wind. Then Goliath stopped, not the distracted pause of a dog catching a scent, not the lazy hesitation of cold paws. He went rigid, ears forward. Low in his chest, something began to vibrate, a sound so deep it felt less like a growl and more like a warning from the ground itself. Talia lifted her head. The wind eased for a heartbeat, and beneath it came something else, a faint tapping. She turned slowly, scanning the white field where snow had folded into smooth, innocent curves. Nothing moved, nothing broke the surface. Then the snow shuddered. A hand burst upward through the crust. Tape wrapped the wrist. Skin scraped raw. Fingers clawed at air like they were reaching for something already gone. For a fraction of a second, Talia did not move. Her heart slammed once, hard enough to make her vision sharpen. The wind came back, dragging ice across her face. The hand twitched again, alive. She ran. Her boots slipped as she dropped to her knees beside the drift. Snow soaked through denim instantly, burning cold. She tore at the crust with bare hands, ignoring the sting as skin split against packed ice. More of him surfaced. A face beneath frost, lips sealed with tape, blood crusted along one cheek, eyes shut. Goliath pressed close, heat against Talia's shoulder. As she dug, she pulled the tape from his mouth first. It came away with a tearing sound that seemed too loud in the empty forest. His chest jerked. Air scraped into lungs that had almost forgotten how. She ripped at the bindings around his wrists. The rope had cut deep, leaving purple grooves in pale skin. His eyes opened. They were not the eyes of a helpless man. They were sharp, assessing, cold, even as his breath came ragged. For a moment they locked on her face as if memorizing it. Then his voice came out in a cracked whisper. "Do not call local cops." The words did not sound like fear. They sounded like instruction. The wind shoved against them again. Talia's stomach dropped, not from the cold, but from what lived behind that warning. She did not ask questions. She slid both arms beneath his shoulders and pulled. He was heavy, dead weight layered with wet snow. Her muscles screamed as she dragged him free of the shallow grave. Goliath shifted immediately, pressing along the man's side, blocking the wind with his massive frame. Talia yanked the thin tarp from her pack. It had been meant for rain, not this. She wrapped it around him, hands shaking from cold and urgency. His breathing rasped in shallow bursts. "You're inside soon," she muttered, more to keep him conscious than to comfort. "Stay awake. Look at me." His eyes flickered but did not close. The abandoned ranger station sat half hidden beyond the trees, a dark shape against the white. She hooked Goliath's leash to the tarp and clipped it to her belt. Then she leaned forward and pulled. Every step sank deep. Every inch cost her something. The wind clawed at her coat. Snow lashed her face until her eyelashes froze together. In the rare pauses when the storm thinned, she thought she heard something distant. An engine, perhaps, or maybe only imagination sharpened by fear. The ranger station door groaned when she drove her shoulder into it. Wood splintered, cold air, and the smell of rot spilled outward. She dragged him inside and shut the door behind them. Darkness swallowed them until she flicked on her small flashlight. The beam cut across warped walls, a mildewed blanket on a table, rope coiled in a corner, like a memory of something worse. She set him against the wall, away from the draft. Goliath pressed along his side again, a living heater. The man's lips had gone nearly purple. Talia crouched close and touched 2 fingers to his neck. A pulse, thin as thread. "You're inside," she said quietly. "Don't sleep." His gaze shifted toward her coat pocket, as if calculating something only he understood. The wind screamed against the walls, and Talia realized she had just pulled something out of the ground that had not been buried by accident. In the knife cold of the ranger station, with snow sealing the world outside, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt watched. The wind battered the ranger station walls until the wood answered in low, splintering groans. Snow pressed against the cracked windows like something alive, testing the seams. Talia forced her hands to stay steady. She slipped her phone from her coat pocket. One thin bar of signal flickered at the top of the screen, then vanished, then returned like a cruel joke. She moved closer to the doorway, lifting the phone higher, angling it toward the storm. "Come on," she whispered, teeth chattering. The call connected on the third attempt. A dispatcher's voice broke through in fragments, thin and distant. She kept her tone level, calm, almost bored. "There's a man with severe hypothermia near the North Trail by the Split Pine. He's unconscious and not breathing well. He needs medical rescue immediately." The dispatcher asked if there were signs of assault. Talia's eyes dropped to the rope marks, to the torn tape on the floorboards, to the shallow cuts across his face. "I'm not sure," she answered evenly. "I found him in the snow." The wind surged. The line crackled. Then the call died. She stood frozen for one breath, listening to the empty tone. Then she moved. She dragged the heavy wooden table toward the door, blocking part of the draft. She stuffed spare clothing into the gaps along the warped frame. She used her boot to scuff at the snow just outside the entrance, erasing the path she had carved through the drifts. When she returned to him, his breathing had grown shallower. She crouched close, brushing snow from his collar. "Stay awake," she murmured. "You only need to answer one word." His eyelids fluttered. For a second, his gaze sharpened again. He studied her like he was measuring the distance between them in something other than feet. Then, slowly, his stiff fingers moved beneath his coat. Talia tensed. He pulled out a heavy signet ring, silver darkened by cold. He pressed it into her palm, the metal bit into her skin. Along with it came a folded slip of paper, damp but intact, a string of numbers and letters scrawled fast, one name written clearer than the rest. "Call Pierce," he rasped. "Use the passcode. Don't trust anyone here." His voice dipped lower, barely audible over the wind. "Ardon." The name settled between them like something sharp. His grip loosened. His head tipped back against the wall, breath thinning to a fragile thread. Talia closed her fist around the ring. It felt too heavy for something so small. She slid both objects into her coat pocket, heart hammering. Outside, an engine growled faintly in the distance. Not close enough to identify, not far enough to ignore. She killed the flashlight. Goliath lifted his head immediately, body stiffening, ears pricked toward the door. The growl returned, low and steady. The engine sound drifted closer, then faded again, swallowed by wind. Talia pressed her ear to the cold wood of the wall. Snow lashed the structure. No headlights cut through the cracks. Then, finally, a siren pierced the storm. Not triumphant, not comforting, sharp, mechanical, inevitable. Relief did not wash over her. It tightened her chest. She opened the door only when red and blue lights flashed against the white outside. Wind slammed into her face, stealing breath. Goliath planted himself in the doorway, massive and immovable. "Inside!" she shouted over the storm. Rescue workers rushed forward, boots sinking deep, stretcher carried between them. Their movements were brisk, professional, eyes scanning. They did not ask questions first. They checked pulse. They wrapped him in thermal blankets. Oxygen mask. Monitors clipped to damp skin. The machine beeped irregularly, then steadier. One responder glanced at her. "Did you see what happened?" "I found him like that," she said. "Buried. No more. No less." They loaded him onto the stretcher and fought the wind back toward the ambulance. Talia followed without thinking. Goliath was guided toward a separate vehicle, resisting only until she touched his neck. "I'm here," she told him, softly. The ride to Cody blurred into flashing lights and the smell of antiseptic. Inside the emergency room, brightness replaced snow. White floors, white walls. The air smelled sharp and clinical. They wheeled him past swinging doors. Doctors moved fast, voices clipped. Talia was stopped in the hallway. She watched through a narrow window as they stripped away soaked layers, pressed warming packs to his chest, inserted lines, adjusted monitors. The steady beep climbed and dipped unpredictably. For one breathless moment, the rhythm on the screen spiked wild. A doctor called out that his pulse was unstable. A jolt ran through his body as they shocked him. Talia's fingers curled into her coat. The line steadied. A single breath escaped her without permission. Footsteps approached from behind. A county sheriff stepped into her peripheral vision. Hat tucked under one arm, badge catching the fluorescent light. "What's your name?" he asked. "Talia Mercer." "Address?" She gave it. "What were you doing in the forest during a storm?" "Walking my dog." His eyes lingered on the scratches across her knuckles, on melted snow dripping from her coat hem. "And you're sure you don't know this man?" "I don't." Her phone vibrated. The sound was small but sharp in the quiet corridor. She glanced down. Unknown number. One message. It mentioned Juniper by name. It reminded her of debts still unpaid. Her vision blurred for a fraction of a second. The sheriff's gaze sharpened. "Everything all right?" "Yes," she answered automatically. Her heart pounded hard enough to make her ears ring, because in that instant, she understood something cold and certain. Someone knew she had pulled him out of the snow, and someone wanted her to remember that rescue had a cost. The hospital corridor smelled of disinfectant and overheated air. Fluorescent lights hummed softly above Talia's head. Too bright, too clean. The sheriff lingered a moment longer before his radio crackled and pulled him away. She exhaled only when he turned the corner. "Ms. Mercer." The voice was calm, low enough that it didn't compete with the hallway noise. She turned. A man in a dark tailored coat stood a few steps back. Snow still clung in faint crystals along the shoulders, already melting into damp streaks. He carried a slim leather briefcase, polished but not flashy. His eyes were sharp and assessing, without being aggressive. Beside him stood another man, taller, broad through the chest, posture relaxed but deliberate. His gaze moved constantly doorways, security cameras, nurses' stations never resting long. "I'm Pierce Langford," the first man said evenly. "I represent von Halbrook." The name settled heavily in the air. Talia felt her pulse climb. "And this is Ian Kels." Ian gave a short nod. No smile. Pierce didn't ask if she was frightened. He didn't ask if she needed water. "Has anyone spoken to you beyond the sheriff?" he asked. "No." "Have you told anyone about the bindings? The tape?" She hesitated a fraction of a second. "No." His eyes flicked to her coat pocket, as if he could sense the weight hidden there. "Good." Ian leaned slightly closer, voice low. "Someone asked about your trailer tonight." Her stomach dropped hard enough to make her sway. Who? A man in a dark sedan, Ayan replied. Lights off, parked long enough to observe. Not local. The fluorescent lights above them buzzed louder in her ears. My daughter, she breathed. Pierce's tone did not rise, but it tightened. Where is she right now? At home. Alone. Talia's jaw clenched. Yes. Ayan's gaze sharpened further. We're leaving? Pierce turned toward the exit without waiting for agreement. We'll handle the sheriff and the medical staff. You need to come with us now. I'm not leaving my daughter, she said sharply. You're not, Pierce answered. We're going to her. The air outside the hospital cut through her coat like knives. Snow swirled under the streetlights, casting everything in a pale, unreal glow. Pierce's car was parked near the entrance, engine already running. Ayan opened the back door. Lock it from the inside, Ayan instructed. Don't open it for anyone but us. The drive toward the edge of Cody felt too short. Talia watched every passing streetlight blur against the windshield. Her breath fogged the glass despite the heat blasting from the vents. She pictured Juniper waking to an empty house, a soft knock at the door, a voice calling her name. When they turned onto the dirt road leading to the row of trailers, Goliath stood at the base of the steps like a dark statue carved from muscle and shadow. His head snapped toward the headlights immediately. The trailer windows were dark. Pierce slowed but did not stop fully. Ayan exited first, moving without haste but with intention. He circled toward the back of the trailer, boots sinking quietly into fresh snow. Talia shoved the door open before the car had completely stopped. She reached the steps in seconds. The door was locked. She fumbled with her keys, hands shaking. The moment it swung open, warm, stale air met her face. Juniper sat curled on the sofa, stuffed animal clutched tight to her chest. Her eyes were wide, rimmed red. Mommy! Talia dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around her daughter. Juniper's small body trembled against her. There was a car, Juniper whispered into her coat. Lights off. It was there a long time. And someone knocked, soft, like they didn't want me to hear. Goliath moved inside behind them, pressing close to Juniper's side. Talia smoothed her daughter's hair, whispering reassurances she barely believed. Ayan entered a moment later, snow melting along his boots. Fresh tire tracks, he said quietly. Recent. Someone stepped near the kitchen window. Talia turned her head. Under the thin exterior light, she saw it an unfamiliar shoe print pressed into the snow, close enough to the wall that someone could have listened. Near the trash bin, a small dark fleck rested against the white, a cigarette tip, freshly extinguished. Her chest tightened painfully. Pierce stepped into the doorway but did not cross the threshold. His voice remained calm, but something colder edged it now. This is no longer speculation. You were watched. I'm not leaving my home, she snapped, rising to her feet. Pierce did not argue. He simply met her eyes. If you stay, the next knock may not be soft. Silence filled the trailer, broken only by the low hum of the heater and Juniper's uneven breathing. You have two options, Pierce continued evenly. Temporary relocation to a controlled property while we assess the threat. Or remain here and accept that whoever did this now knows where your daughter sleeps. The word sleeps landed hard. Talia's pride flared hot and useless. This trailer was small, drafty, cheap, but it was hers. She looked down at Juniper, who still clung to her coat string like it was a lifeline. How long? Talia asked, voice hoarse. Until the risk is neutralized, Pierce replied. You retain full agency. This is protective logistics, not control. Ayan added quietly. We need to move before they circle back. Goliath's head lifted again. A faint growl vibrated through his chest. Decision arrived like cold water. Talia moved fast. She dragged an old suitcase from beneath the bed and shoved clothes inside without folding. Medications, insurance cards, Juniper's vaccination records, the worn stuffed animal, a small envelope of important documents she kept hidden behind overdue bills. She paused only once, hand hovering over a stack of threatening letters, and then shoved those in too. When she stepped outside again, snow had begun falling harder. Ayan scanned the tree line one last time. They left without lights flashing, without spectacle. As the car pulled away, Talia watched the trailer shrink in the rearview mirror. Goliath lay across Juniper's feet in the back seat. Juniper's breathing slowly steadied. Pierce drove toward the mountains, where the road narrowed and pine trees thickened on either side. An iron gate appeared ahead, opening silently before they reached it. Talia felt something shift inside her. She had stepped out of poverty, but she had not stepped out of danger. She had only crossed into a different kind of it. The gate closed behind them without a sound. Beyond it, the road curved through dense pine, snow hanging heavy on the branches like quiet witnesses. The house emerged slowly, dark timber, wide windows glowing amber against the night. It looked warm. It looked expensive. It did not look safe. The front door opened before Pierce reached it. Inside, heat wrapped around them immediately. The air smelled faintly of leather and something clean, almost clinical. The floors were dark stone, polished enough to catch reflections of movement. Cameras sat discreetly in the corners, tiny red lights blinking. Talia noticed them all. She noticed the keypad lock near the door, the subtle sensor along the window frame, the way Ayan's eyes traced every angle before stepping fully inside. This was not comfort. This was containment. Juniper stood still in the entryway, staring up at the ceiling beams. Goliath shook snow from his coat, sending droplets across the stone. Pierce set his briefcase down on a long wooden table. "There are a few rules," he said evenly. "You may move freely within the main areas. Some rooms are restricted. Do not open the door for anyone. Do not use your real name when ordering anything. Do not post online. Do not answer unknown numbers." Each instruction landed like a brick. Talia crossed her arms. "And how long am I supposed to live like this?" "Until the variables narrow," Pierce replied calmly. Juniper's small hand slipped into Talia's coat sleeve. "Mommy," she whispered, "is this where we're staying?" "For now," Talia answered softly. Ayan stepped back toward the hallway. "I'll rotate shifts." The house grew quieter after that, but it was not peaceful quiet. It was measured, controlled. Every door closed softly. Every footstep felt calculated. Later, when Juniper had been shown to an upstairs room with a bed larger than necessary and thick curtains blocking the forest view, Talia returned downstairs alone. The study door stood half open. She paused. Inside, the lighting was lower. Dark wood shelves lined the walls. A single lamp cast a muted glow across a desk stacked with papers. Vaughn sat in a chair near the fireplace, one arm wrapped in fresh bandaging beneath a black shirt. His skin still held a faint pallor, but his posture was upright, controlled. He did not rise when she entered. He simply watched her. For a moment, neither spoke. Then his voice broke the silence. "You should understand the scale of what you stepped into." "I didn't step into anything," she replied sharply. "I was walking my dog." A flicker of something unreadable crossed his eyes. "There's a shipping corridor through these mountains," he said. "It's become contested. Calder Rusk wants it. And that matters to me because he doesn't compete quietly." The fire cracked softly in the hearth. "He doesn't just win," Vaughn continued. "He stages it, makes a ritual of it." Talia's jaw tightened. And the man who buried you? Ardon Vale, Vaughn said without hesitation. An insider, the name pressed coldly against her memory. He sold a meeting location, Vaughn added. Sold the gap between plowed road and deep snow. And now? She asked. Now he's exposed. Vaughn replied calmly. Which makes him dangerous. Talia stepped closer, stopping at the edge of the desk. I don't want money, she said plainly. I don't want protection that feels like a leash. I want paperwork. The word hung between them. Vaughn's brow tightened slightly. Paperwork, she repeated. I want documentation stating I found you and called rescue. I want every expense tied to this house recorded as temporary protection costs, receipts, contracts, signatures. He didn't interrupt. And I want a custody shield, she finished. If someone calls child services with a story, I want a file thick enough to shut it down. The fire popped sharply. For the first time, Vaughn leaned back in his chair, studying her more carefully. You think the system will be weaponized against you? He said. I know it will, she answered flatly. Silence stretched. Pierce will draft it, Vaughn said finally. That's not enough, she pressed. I want an exit clause. I leave when I choose. No retaliation, no strings. His eyes sharpened at that. You're negotiating terms, he observed. I'm protecting my daughter. A faint breath left him, almost a laugh, but without humor. You're not asking for money. No, you're asking for structure. Yes. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air tighter. Vaughn's gaze drifted toward the staircase for a brief second, toward where Juniper slept, then back to Talia. You'll have it? He said shortly. Not a promise. A decision. Talia held his gaze another moment, then turned toward the door. As she stepped into the hallway, the faint sound of claws against wood echoed softly. Goliath stood near the back glass doors, head angled toward the dark forest beyond. His posture was rigid. A low, steady vibration hummed in his chest. Talia felt the change instantly. What is it? She whispered. The security lights outside flicked on, in a sequence 1, 2, 3, cutting across snow like bright dots in a line. A faint beam of light swept once across the fence and vanished. Ayan appeared from the far end of the hall, as if summoned by instinct alone. Inside, he murmured. Juniper's bedroom door opened upstairs. Mommy. Talia moved fast, scooping her daughter into her arms. It's a game, she said softly, heart pounding. Hide and stay quiet. Goliath followed them into the innermost room, body blocking the doorway once it closed. Downstairs, something shifted. A door opened silently. Footsteps brief, controlled. A muffled impact, then nothing. The absence of noise was worse than shouting. Minutes passed before a soft knock touched the bedroom door. It's clear, Ayan said quietly. When Talia stepped back into the hallway, the house looked unchanged. No broken glass, no raised voices. Vaughn stood near the back entrance, eyes colder than the night outside. One of Calder's scouts, Pierce said calmly from the kitchen. They confirmed you're alive. Talia looked at Vaughn. And me, she asked. They were mapping, Ayan answered. The word mapping made her skin prickle. Talia's breath came shallow. I want to leave, she said. You can, Vaughn replied evenly, but not blindly. He stepped closer, not invading space, but not retreating either. If you run into the night with no structure, they'll find you before morning. The truth of it settled heavily. Upstairs, Juniper's small voice drifted faintly through the floorboards, asking Goliath to stay close. Talia closed her eyes briefly. This house was a cage, but outside it, the forest was waiting. Morning did not arrive with sunlight. It arrived with a thin gray wash across the snow, and the steady hum of security systems resetting themselves. The house felt tighter than it had the night before. Not louder, just more aware. Talia stood at the kitchen counter, hands wrapped around a mug she had not touched. The coffee had gone cold. Across the room, Juniper sat at the wide wooden table drawing slow, careful lines across thick paper. Goliath lay at her feet, but he did not sleep. His eyes tracked every small sound. Footsteps moved downstairs, measured, disciplined. Guards changing shifts. A controlled environment. Talia hated how quickly she was getting used to it. Pierce entered the kitchen carrying a thin stack of printed pages clipped together. He placed them on the counter with a soft thud. "The preliminary documentation," he said. She looked down. "Temporary protective housing agreement. Dated. Time-stamped. Her name clearly stated as a civilian witness. Expense ledger attached. Itemized." Her eyes moved quickly. "Where's the custody clause?" she asked. "Second section," Pierce replied calmly. She flipped the pages. There it was. A statement that any support provided was not compensation, not employment, not affiliation. Explicit language stating she retained full legal guardianship of her child, and that no arrangement constituted coercion. She exhaled slowly. "This is a draft," Pierce added. "We'll notarize this afternoon." Across the room, Juniper's pencil scratched lightly against paper. Talia signed the bottom of the first page anyway. The sound of pen on paper felt heavier than it should have. Goliath's head lifted. A low vibration began in his chest. Talia froze. It was not loud. It was not frantic. It was the same sound that had preceded everything else. Pierce glanced toward the windows. The security lights outside flickered once, then stabilized. Ian's voice carried faintly from another room, low and controlled. "Movement near the north fence." Juniper's pencil stopped mid-line. Talia moved instinctively, crossing the room and pulling her daughter into her arms. "It's just the wind," she said softly, even though she knew it wasn't. Goliath stood now, muscles tight beneath thick fur. From the living room, a quiet series of clicks echoed, locks engaging. The house did not panic. It shifted. Aeon passed through the kitchen without breaking stride. He didn't carry visible weapons. He didn't rush. His hand brushed briefly against his ear, murmuring something too low to catch. "Stay inside," he told Talia without looking at her. No shouting, no chaos, just containment. The faint crunch of boots on snow filtered through the glass. Then silence. Too much silence. Juniper clung tighter to Talia's coat. "Mommy, stay with me." Minutes stretched thin. Then a soft thud. Another. Something being guided, not thrown. The back door opened quietly. Talia's breath caught. Aeon stepped in, snow dusting his shoulders. A thin red scratch cut across his knuckles. Nothing else appeared disturbed. "It's handled," he said simply. Pierce's eyes narrowed slightly. One, Aeon confirmed. "Scout team. Testing. No sirens. No gunshots." The house returned to stillness as if nothing had happened. Talia felt her heartbeat thudding in her throat. "What does testing mean?" she asked. "It means they're mapping responses," Pierce replied. "Timing. Reaction speed. And now they know this property isn't unguarded." Goliath remained standing for several long seconds before slowly lowering himself back down, but he did not relax. Talia knelt beside Juniper. "You're safe," she whispered. Juniper nodded, but her eyes remained wide. Later, after Juniper had been distracted with a puzzle and the kitchen quieted again, Talia found Vaughn near the back windows. He stood with one hand resting lightly on the frame, gaze fixed on the snow beyond the fence. His posture was still controlled, but there was something heavier in the air around him. "They're escalating," she said. "Yes, and you knew they would." He didn't deny it. "They want confirmation," he replied. "That I'm alive. That you're here." "Why me?" "Because you interfered with a ritual," Vaughn said calmly. "Calder doesn't forgive interruptions." The word ritual made her skin prickle. "I'm not part of your war," she snapped. He turned toward her slowly. "You are now," he said, "because they believe your leverage." Silence stretched between them. Talia felt anger flare hot and useless. "I want out," she said. "You can leave," he answered evenly, "but not without structure." "There's that word again. Structure keeps you alive." She crossed her arms tightly. "You solve problems by removing them." "One. Yes. And you didn't remove that one." His eyes sharpened slightly. "Because spectacle would confirm everything they want confirmed," he replied. "Violence draws federal heat. Procedure buries them slower." She studied him. "You're changing tactics." "I'm choosing tactics." A faint sound interrupted them. Pierce re-entered the room holding his phone. "Social Services received an anonymous inquiry this morning," he said calmly. "Concern about your daughter's environment." The words landed cold. Talia's hands curled into fists. "Already?" she whispered. "They're efficient," Pierce replied. "Weaponizing the system is cleaner than bullets." Juniper's laughter drifted faintly from the kitchen as she showed Goliath her drawing. The sound felt fragile. Talia straightened. "Then we move faster," she said. Pierce watched her carefully. "I'll prepare the custody file, medical records, school history, timeline documentation. I want copies," she said immediately. "Physical and digital. You'll have them." Vaughn studied her face. "This is what they'll use," she continued. "They'll try to say I brought her into danger." "You did," Vaughn said bluntly. Her eyes flashed. "But not willingly," he added. She didn't look away. "I won't let them write that story," she said. Outside, the wind picked up again, snow sweeping across the fence in white waves. Inside the house, systems hummed steadily. Goliath's low growl had faded, but it had left something behind. Proof. The threat was no longer abstract. It had stepped close enough to test the glass, and it would be back. The first envelope arrived without a return address. It was forwarded from Cody, stamped twice, the paper slightly damp from snow. Talia stood at the kitchen counter under warm, recessed lights and slid it open with a butter knife. Inside was a printed notice. Formal language. Concern about the welfare of a minor child, allegedly exposed to individuals involved in criminal activity. It mentioned evaluation. It mentioned review. It did not mention proof. Juniper was upstairs doing math at the small desk Pierce had arranged. Goliath lay stretched across the threshold of the hallway, eyes half closed but not asleep. Talia's pulse slowed instead of spiking. This was the tactic Pierce had warned about. Weaponized procedure. Pierce entered the room moments later, already holding his tablet. "It started," he said. She handed him the letter. He scanned it quickly. Anonymous report. No direct evidence cited. "That's expected." Her jaw tightened. "How soon?" "They may call. They may visit. It depends on how much pressure is applied behind the scenes." She folded the letter carefully, instead of crumpling it. "Show me," she said. Pierce placed a thick binder on the table. It was not decorative. Black cover, metal rings, tabs in clean colors. The first tab read, "Timeline." Under it, printed pages with dates and times, hospital intake records, dispatch logs, names of medical responders, each page stamped with time received. The next tab, financial documentation, ledger entries clearly labeled, "Temporary protective housing expense." Itemized, Receipts attached. No cash transfers. No irregular language. Third tab. Custody protection. Medical records. School attendance history. Vaccination cards. Copies of identification. A notarized statement prepared but not yet signed. Talia ran her fingers lightly over the plastic sleeves. This is what they'll try to pierce, Pierce said quietly. So we reinforce it. Her phone vibrated on the table. Unknown number. She answered. Hello? A social worker's voice came through, professional but cautious. Miss Mercer, we received a report regarding your daughter's living situation. Talia's eyes remained on the binder. Yes, she said evenly. We'd like to verify certain information. Of course, she replied. Her fingers flipped the timeline tab open. What is your current address? The woman asked. Talia read from the printed housing agreement in front of her. Temporary protective residence arranged due to a violent incident, I reported. Documented and filed. There was a pause on the line. And the individual referenced in the report? I found an injured man and called medical services. I am not employed by him, affiliated with him, or receiving illicit compensation. Her tone never rose. Pierce watched silently, making a small note in the margin of his tablet. We may schedule a visit. The social worker continued. I welcome it, Talia replied. All records are prepared. She hung up only after the call ended formally. Her hands were steady. Goliath lifted his head briefly, then rested it back down. That was clean, Pierce said. It's not over, she answered. It rarely is. The second pressure point came 2 days later. Her phone rang again. This time, she recognized the voice immediately. Hey, Talia, Brent Huxley. The air seemed to thin. I heard you're mixed up with something big, he said, tone sliding between false concern and smugness. That little girl deserves stability. Her gaze dropped to Juniper through the open doorway. The child was coloring quietly, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. Do not contact me again, Talia said, evenly. You think a rich man's house makes you untouchable? Brent laughed softly. All it takes is a story. They'll take her before you can blink. The sound of his voice scraped across old scars. You're being recorded, she replied. A short silence. Record this then, he muttered. I'll tell them you brought her into a gang house. She ended the call. Her hand trembled only after she set the phone down. Pierce entered from the hallway, having heard enough through the speaker. We'll add it, he said. To what? She asked. To the petition. She nodded once. Cameras were installed that afternoon, small, discreet devices positioned legally within property boundaries. One at the front gate, one angled toward the driveway, one in the main living area where Juniper usually played. Not to trap him, Pierce explained quietly. To document him. Brent returned sooner than expected. His car idled beyond the gate, engine low, headlights off. Snow drifted slowly around the tires. He called again. I just want to talk, he said. I can help you. CPS listens to fathers. You don't have custody. She replied flatly. I don't need it, he said. I just need concern. She didn't respond. Instead, she held the phone away, letting it record. From the corner of her eye, she saw Goliath rise slowly, muscles tightening. Minutes later, Brent's car rolled forward slightly, as if testing the boundary. Security lights flared bright along the fence line. Ian's silhouette appeared near the far edge of the property. Brent reversed immediately and drove away. Pierce's tablet chimed. He studied the screen, brow lowering. His number just pinged another contact, he said. Who? Talia asked. A shell shipping company we've been tracking. The name surfaced quietly. Ardan Vale. Talia felt the connection settle into place, like ice forming across water. He's not calling on his own, she said. No, Pierce agreed. He's being fed lines. The realization didn't break her. It sharpened her. She opened the binder again and slid a new sheet into a sleeve. Incoming call. Date, time, duration, content summary. She labeled it calmly. Outside, snow continued to fall in patient silence. Inside, paper accumulated. And for the first time since the envelope arrived, Talia understood something clearly. If they wanted to use the system as a blade, she would answer with documentation thick enough to dull it. The study smelled of ink and warm paper. A printer hummed in the corner, spitting out pages with a dry, metallic snap. Talia stood over the desk, fingertips resting on a sheet that bore a stamped time and the hospital seal. The binder lay open beside it like a bedside Bible, tabs bright, sleeves full, evidence ordered so precisely it felt like armor. Pierce moved between her and the printer, with the quiet economy of someone who had practiced this motion 1,000 times. He slid a new packet toward her, a notarized affidavit from an EMT, a dispatch log with a crisp timestamp, a witness statement signed that morning by a medic who had been on scene. Chain of custody, he said, tapping the plastic sleeve. Every hand, every moment, recorded. We build this so the story cannot be rearranged. Talia read the pages as if learning to read anew. Dispatch entry, time, caller, coordinates, hospital intake, hypothermia, tape marks, EMT signature inked and dated. Each stamp landed like a small conviction. Vaughn was in the room, leaning back in the low chair near the window. The bandage still wrapped his arm, but he watched the pile of paper the way a general watches troops form. He did not look like a man softened by gratitude. He looked like a man reshaping a war into rules he could win. We'll proceed by audit, not by muscle, he said quietly. His voice carried the same flat certainty that had made people obey before. Talia's jaw tightened. You'll shut Ardan down? He'll make mistakes to move money, Vaughn answered. You can't hide a trace when someone starts closing the routes. We force him to expose himself. Pierce clicked a pen in his fingers and handed Talia a small form. It was a simple document, an authorization for temporary expenses, a promise on letterhead that every dollar spent would be logged, that no payment constituted affiliation. You insisted on structure, Pierce reminded her. She signed. The pen scratched in a way that sounded final. They moved next to custody. Pierce showed her the folder labeled Custody Protection. Inside, Juniper's pediatric records, a notarized letter from a school counselor, vaccination cards, proof of stable attendance lodged before the storm, sworn statements attesting to Talia's parenting. Each file had been photocopied, stamped, and logged. Pierce had added a page with potential questions from Child Protective Services and model answers short, factual lines Talia could practice. Keep answers short, Pierce coached. Name, date, location, no emotion. Document any call you get. Repeat the date. Do not improvise. Talia practiced aloud once, twice. Her voice stayed flat and bare. I found a man on the North Trail. I called emergency services at 10:01. I am not affiliated with any illegal activity. Juniper padded into the room with a small stack of colored paper and handed it to her mother. The child's drawing slipped from tiny fingers, an awkward house under a smudged sun. Talia folded it and slid it into the binder behind the medical records, a domestic artifact placed beside stamped affidavits. People weaponize procedure, Vaughn said, watching Talia's hands. That's Calder's preferred language. But we answer with the system itself, louder, steadier. Pierce tapped the tablet on his knee. We've identified the shipping shells. We open one set of accounts to audit. We let Ardan try to reroute funds. He'll leave a trail. We serve papers in Georgia, New Jersey, and Illinois at once. We force him to move in daylight. The printer stopped. The final page slid onto the desk, a consolidated ledger cross-referenced with bank IDs and time-stamped transfers. Talia traced a line with her thumb. The numbers were abstract, but the pattern felt like a net drawing tight. Hours passed in small procedural motions, copies, stamps, signatures, notary seals, a thin rhythm of industry. Outside the window, the wind pressed at the trees, and the sky leaned the color of old metal. Inside, lights hummed, and the security camera in the corner captured everything in a pale, patient eye. Pierce cleared his throat. We'll file a petition tomorrow to preempt any malicious report. We request a stay on any immediate removal actions pending review of this packet. Talia imagined a courtroom not as a stage but as a ledger. Facts, dates, signatures. She imagined walking in with a binder that did not tremble. Later, Vaughn rose and walked to the back door. He stood for a long moment, watching the trees. "I didn't want to fence you in with comfort," he said without turning. "But if they make procedure a weapon, we'll make procedure a shield." She let the idea rest in her bones. Shield versus sword. As evening deepened, they practiced more. Pierce playing a social worker, Talia reciting the short, factual lines until the words felt like tools and not pleas. Juniper sat with Goliath between her legs, quiet as a small audience. When they paused, a dull vibration moved through the house. The lights dimmed briefly, as if someone had scrolled their hand across the ceiling. The house held its breath. For a second, there was only the soft sound of the printer ink drying and a clock ticking in the hall. Then glass near the back of the house chimed a clear, single note like a bell struck far away. Something had touched the exterior, gentle enough to avoid breakage but deliberate enough to be noticed. Goliath rose, every muscle contracting, and Ayane's footsteps fell into place with practiced speed. Talia felt a familiar spike in her throat. She closed the binder and slid her hand over the cover. Paper, she thought, could hold the world together. Outside, the snow pressed against the windows like a question. The blizzard became a white wall that ate sound. Trees disappeared into sheets of blowing snow until everything narrowed to the rhythm of breath and the small, urgent details underfoot. Talia's hood was pulled low. Her wrists dug into the packed drift, where rope bit like wire. Juniper stood beside her, small and shivering, a mittened hand clasped over her mouth to muffle a cry. They had been dragged into a pocket of trees, as if someone had cut a hole into the world and tossed them there. The men who held them moved with the hush of predators, no shouting, no clumsy panic hands practiced at the business of silence. A cloth pressed across Talia's face smelled of oil and cigarettes. The night tasted metallic and very close. One man crouched in front of them and spat words that were meant to be a ceremony. The voice had a rhythm that wanted to be remembered. "This is where he learned what it meant not to breathe," the man said, voice sharp as flint. "You'll make him understand." Calder Rusk stepped from the trees like a man walking into a chapel. His coat was dark, his hood gone, a face carved of deliberate cruelty. He moved with the calm of someone certain an audience would see the intended grandeur. He wanted spectacle. He wanted the ritual. Talia felt heat flare, not from the cold, but from some animal inside her that kept thinking fast, seeking angles. Juniper trembled beside her, eyes enormous and watery. Goliath's absence was a hard ache. The dog's leash lay in the snow where it had been cut. Talia's throat closed around a single thought. Keep breathing, keep small, keep telling Juniper nothing that could give them away. A low engine cut through the wind near then far like a note struck and held. Talia could not tell whether it was mercy or a countdown. Calder's voice calmed as if narrating his triumph. Von Halbrook, he said, speaking Von's name like a prayer of hate. You will come to the place you were buried, and you will kneel. You will admit what belongs to me. You will tell me how you lived out of the earth, and when you stand up, the lesson will be written into the snow. The men who held Talia tightened their grips, as if the words were a signal. Somewhere beyond the trees, a shadow detached itself from the dark and moved with the purposeful calm of trained horses. Tires scuffed snow. Lights were kept low. Talia's jaw worked against the gag. Her hands, bound behind her, felt suddenly less like a physical restraint and more like a thread tying her to a particular dread. You think you can make him kneel? A voice cut through, low and amused. Not Calder's. It belonged to a man who had not yet revealed himself, but whose presence shifted the air like a pause in music. Vaughn walked from the line of trees as if stepping into a painting. He was not armored in bluster. He was a lean figure wrapped in a shirt and bandages, eyes kinetic, measuring distance. Snow clung to his sleeves. Blood darkened the cuff near his ribs. He did not hurry. He did not look like a man who was rushing to save anything that night. He looked like a man who had wanted precisely this scene. Calder grinned, the sort of grin that expects applause. You're late, he said. Timing is part of the ceremony? Vaughn replied quietly. Calder's laugh was soft. He spread his hands to the trees, as if indicating the scope of his plan. I wanted the audience to come, he said. I wanted him to feel it again. Watch him break, and the ritual will be complete. Vaughn stepped closer until the wind seemed to hollow out around him. He didn't look at Talia. His gaze threaded through the group, found Calder, and measured the man's swagger like one inspects a weapon for flaws. Around them men shifted the scouts, the figures whose job had been mapping fences and timing doors. Talia could feel Vaughn's presence even through her gag. It was a different kind of force than the men in coats. It was a quiet, like a gathering storm. You want a confession, Vaughn said, slow. You want spectacle. Say it again. Say who inside my world sold the schedule. Say how this was arranged. Calder's eyes brightened, as if Vaughn had handed him a microphone. He leaned forward, savoring the expected power. Arden Vale, he said, voice loud enough for the trees to keep as witness. He sold the gap. He sold the plowed mile. He took money and handed over the map. The name landed like a stone into still water. Vaughn did not shout. He did not draw a gun. He moved his hand toward his coat and pulled something small, no larger than a matchbox, from inside. A device, black and simple, clicked on with a faint, almost indifferent beat. Vaughn slipped it into his palm and then into his jacket pocket, where it kept company with paper he hadn't yet shown. The device's tiny light blinked once. It was a recorder. It was a witness, Calder continued, warmed by his own speaking. He paced words into action. Shipping shells, payment corridors, bribes disguised as invoices, the names of men who thought themselves careful. He spoke like a man who mistook arrogance for invisibility. He described routes, deposits, and the ritualistic way he intended to make the world watch. Vaughn let him talk. Talia watched his face the way you watch smoke. There was no triumph in Vaughn's expression, only a focus so precise it trembled on the edge of something faintly cruel. Each sentence Calder let loose was a stitch in a trap. Behind Vaughn, through the white, Talia glimpsed movement figures slipping into the periphery like stagehands taking position. Lights, legal teams, lines of paper being woven into subpoenas and chains of custody across states. Pierce's name flared in her head, a warm, steady thing. She could not see him, but she felt the machinery he had promised starting to run. Calder's voice climbed to a crowning boast, how he would make Vaughn kneel in the snow, and how he would watch the old kingpin bow. He described the exact spot where the ground had been uncannily soft, how the earth had been packed around a man like a promise. Vaughn's hand slid into view, fingers finding the recorder's small edge. "Say the rest," he murmured. Calder obliged. He spoke of contractors, of a man who met him at a diner with a post-it, of a number that routed through a shell company in another state. He spoke of a name he barked out like a prayer, and that name landed as proof on the recorder that blinked beside Vaughn's heart. Talia felt something odd unhook inside her. The terror did not lift. It shifted into a brittle clarity. If Calder's mouth would not stop, then words could be proof. And proof was the only way out that did not end with blood in the snow. A scent drifted fuel, warm and alive, and the night seemed to hold itself ready. Calder, drunk on the idea of spectacle, did not notice that his confession was being folded into other hands. Vaughn let the recorder do its work. He let Calder paint the rest of the map with his own voice. When at last Calder paused, as if savoring the final note, Vaughn did not congratulate him. He stepped forward and said in a voice thin and even, "One more thing. Who else touched the money?" Calder smiled as if the question were an invitation, and then, in the uncompromising white, Calder named the men and the accounts, each syllable a thread that would be pulled in daylight. Talia tightened her fingers against the rope at her wrists. Juniper leaned into her side, small and trembling, and for the first time since the men had come, she felt the wind shift on its axis, not toward doom, but toward a vast, slow force that moved through paperwork and court dockets and men who knew how to read a ledger like a map. Far off, like an echo catching at trees, another engine drew closer. Outside the circle of men, a tiny red light blinked in Vaughn's coat pocket, patient and steady. The shot cut through the wind like a cracked bell. For a heartbeat, the snow seemed to hold still, each flake frozen mid-fall. Calder's mouth hung open, face lit by triumph. Then the world rushed into motion. A gloved arm jerked from the trees quick, practiced firing not at Vaughn but into the white between them. The round sang and punched through the night, and the next sound was Vaughn's body moving. He launched himself forward before the echo finished, not running, not charging, but folding his frame into a deliberate arc that put him between the bullet's line and the little figures at his feet. Talia saw him more than felt him an immediate weight. A living shield whose ribs took impact like a trade. The slug struck him in the torso with a dull, internal roar. The force made him stagger. Snow sprayed like red glass where he hit. For an impossible second, he stayed upright, eyes wide, not at pain but at calculation, measuring whether the strike had done enough to stop him. Goliath hit the circle of trees like freight. The dog's ribs smashed into a man's chest. Teeth found coat and fabric and arm. The defender's face snapped back in a staccato scream. Snow flared up around the scuffle. Goliath's growl was a low engine. It set the night vibrating with threat. Two of Vaughn's men were already falling through the white, cutting through the crowd with practiced speed. One yanked a knife and slashed the rope at Talia's wrists. The other wrenched bindings from Juniper, as if opening a latch. Hands that had been gentle moments before now moved like they had been born to these motions, quick, exact, merciless in their focus. Talia's gag was ripped from her mouth with rough, efficient fingers. She sucked air like a drowning thing and tried to inhale steadier for Juniper's sake. The child's mouth was a small, round O, eyes huge and wet, the wind stitching tears across her cheeks. Talia reached for her, only to find Vaughn already there. One arm curled around Juniper's narrow shoulders, as if to make a second wall. Vaughn's breath came ragged, each exhale a tiny storm. Blood seeped between his fingers and the bandage that had once been a neat wrap. He did not look for pity. He looked for movement. Who was down? Who was watching? Calder barked orders, and two men ducked back toward the brush, a motion that smelled of calculation rather than panic. Calder's scout, the gunman, tried to pull himself upright through the snow, but Goliath had him pinned, jaws working at a coat collar, breath steaming. The man kicked, cursing, hands sweeping for a knife that wasn't there. It was chaos and choreography at once. Goliath's muzzle bleeding, Vaughn bleeding, boots skidding, men shouting orders in clipped syllables that meant only one thing: extract. A light blinked red on Vaughn's recorder when the first few words of Calder's confession played on a tiny speaker, a witness to the boast that had become its own undoing. "Get them out!" Vaughn rasped, voice thin and urgent. His men obeyed the way they had been taught: stack, lift, cover. Talia found herself being hauled toward the trees. Juniper tucked close, Goliath still snarling and refusing to let go. The broken breath of the blizzard beat at their backs. Footfalls pounded like a second heartbeat. They brought Vaughn up onto a makeshift sled of jackets and canvas. His face had gone pale under the splashes of blood. His eyes kept returning to Talia's, as if checking that the line between them was still held. "You're not," she began. His hand closed on hers with surprising strength. "You made a choice," he said, words leaking red. "You dug me out. Don't unmake it." A bullet tore a notch through a nearby tree, and splinters flew like desperate sparks. One of Calder's men tried to slither away, but Pierce's shadow cut him down silent, a presence at the edge that had been building all night. Pierce moved as someone who had expected this moment, his briefcase already open to reveal a phone and a stack of papers that would matter tomorrow, but could not change what was bleeding now. Ayan had the scout secured with cuffs that bit leather. The man's curses softened into something hoarse. Goliath let go reluctantly, focus shifting from bite to watch, eyes still dark and calculating. Juniper clung to Vaughn's jacket until her small fingers whitened. Someone called a medic. Whether it was one of Vaughn's men or a rescue pulled from the sound of the engine, Talia could not tell. The next minutes blurred into bright, urgent business: warm packs against wounds, a tourniquet fashioned from a belt, a face shoved into pleading lines of first aid taught in cold hands. Vaughn's breath was a ragged rhythm. He kept his eyes on Calder, who stood near the trees, suddenly smaller despite the sled of men on which he had once relied. The recorder's light blinked again. Calder's words looped in the white, a slow, damning echo. Talia knelt in the snow and pressed both hands to Vaughn's chest, where blood soaked through bandage and shirt. Her palms were numb, but her touch was precise, as if every gesture might stitch him in place. He blinked, tried to smile, and the motion made his face look absurdly small and human against the vastness of the storm. "Can you—" she started. He shook his head, but his fingers tightened around hers, and in that grip was a promise and a command. Keep the story, keep the proof, keep Juniper. Not because he asked it kindly, but because he knew how to turn a wound into leverage and a confession into an indictment. They hoisted Vaughn onto the sled and began to move, men forming a rough perimeter. The forest swallowed the shapes as they went, the snow swallowing footprints and the recorder's soft red light. Behind them, Calder's voice ebbed, and then was a small, distant sound, an attempt to reclaim spectacle now useless against a recorded confession and a body that had chosen to take the blow. Talia looked down at her hands, white from the cold, then at Juniper, tucked close, and finally breathing in small, even pulls. Goliath's head rested on the sled's edge, eyes half closed but watchful. Vaughn's blood had darkened the snow. It would melt into evidence later, or be scrubbed from memory. For now, it marked the moment when a man's decision to stand as a shield made a pair of choices impossible to untangle. They moved through the white, the house of lights, a distant promise on the ridge, every step a tally toward the place where needles of paper and questions would meet, the blunt, red truth of what had happened. The hospital smelled of bleach and winter, a clean smell that tried to erase the forest. Talia sat on a vinyl chair beneath a humming fluorescent strip, the binder heavy in her lap, like a sleeping animal. Through the glass, Vaughn's door blinked with steady light. Inside, machines kept the rhythm of a body that had decided to come back. Goliath lay curled at the end of a sterile corridor, eyes half closed but watchful as a slow clock. Juniper slept in a small cot in a family room, a guard on either side, a stuffed animal clenched in her fist. In the intervening hours, things had rearranged themselves into a system Talia could understand. Calder and his scouts had been taken law, not spectacle. Federal agents had trailed leads. Pierce handed them recordings, timestamps, crossing ledgers that made shells into naked roots. Arden Vale's name had unspooled into seizure orders and frozen accounts. Men who thought they hid by layers of money found themselves unrolled into paperwork. Calder's arrest came without a show, cuffs and quiet statements. The arresting officers polite and businesslike as men who smelled of other states. Pierce had not smiled once during the sweep. He moved like a man who knew the landscape of paper and power, whose hands had been trained to tuck evidence between pages where it could not be lost. He brought updates in packets, copies of federal affidavits with stamped headers, the morning's hearing calendar. Each stamp felt like a small victory. Now he set a new stack on Talia's knees. Sealed envelopes, a notarized agreement that Vaughn had insisted be ironclad. One envelope contained a bank account, opened in her name only, with access codes she could change tomorrow if she wanted. Another held a vocational plan, trade school options, a pathway to a day job with steady income, an apprenticeship agreement with a company that had agreed to interview her. The last envelope was the clause she had demanded all along, a clean, clear exit clause, notarized and witnessed, stating she could leave the protective arrangement on her terms without penalty or threat. Vaughn had been blunt when he handed it to Pierce. She leaves when she wants, no strings, he told the lawyer. The lawyer had written it down, stamped it, retyped it, sealed it with a notary's thumbprint. The paper trembled in Talia's hands, not because it was weak, but because it held a promise she had never expected to see in print. "Do you understand what this does?" Pierce asked softly. "It says I can go," she said. "It also says the state cannot remove Juniper based on rumors," Pierce added. "We filed a preemptive petition and included your binder. The court set a hearing time. Social services reviewed the packet and did not recommend removal. They recommended support. That's everything." Outside, a judge's clerk had seen the chain of custody and the recorded confession and adjusted the cold machinery of process. They did not call it a miracle. They called it evidence. The social worker came to the family room the next morning with a clipboard and a calm face. She asked questions that Pierce had coached Talia on: short, factual, repeated. She opened the binder and read stamped hospital records, the EMT affidavit, the timestamps on the recorder. She asked Juniper polite, small questions about school and friends. She lifted the child's drawing from the custody tab, turned it, smiled with a softness that was almost human kindness, and left with a note to the file. When the county letter arrived, it was bureaucratic and precise. No immediate removal recommended. Further review scheduled contingent on continued documentation. It read like a small victory. Talia folded it and slid it into the binder, feeling the paper hum as if newly alive. Days later, Vaughn sat up longer in the hospital chair. He did not celebrate. He did something quieter. He brought Talia a small envelope, the edges worn where paper had been held. Inside was the notation of an account number and a printed plan. A certificate program for workplace safety, followed by guaranteed interviews for entry-level positions at a contracting company Vaughn's people had a relationship with. It was practical. It was not charity. "You can walk away with what puts you on your feet," Vaughn said. His voice was low. The bandage on his side was clean and white. "Not because I bought you, but because you deserve the choice." She stared at him for a long time. Anger still lived under her ribs like a coal, a heat that made every polite word from him feel sticky. But there was also something else, an acknowledgement, halting and dangerous, that what he offered could keep Juniper safe on terms that were hers. "I won't be bought," she said finally. "You already said that," he answered. "This is structure." She thought of the binder, the way it had become armor, and the small clicks of stamps and notary seals that had turned threats into paper. She thought of the size of her hands, of the old trailer and the dented kitchen table, of nights she had counted bills and bruises until the numbers blurred. Choice, in the end, was not the same as freedom, but it was the only currency she had a right to spend. "Will you sign it?" Pierce asked. Pen held like a bridge. She took the pen. Her signature was a line that felt like a hinge. The ink dried and did not run. Outside, Winter stepped down a degree. Juniper walked the corridor between the family room and the play area, hair in a messy ponytail, Goliath padding solidly at her side. She looked up at Talia and smiled, a small, open thing. Talia closed the binder then. She opened the door to Vaughn's room and left the envelope on his bedside table, half as a return and half as a test. He nodded once, as if he had expected nothing less. On the drive back toward the safe house, the world felt both the same and rearranged. The mountains wore their white collars. The trees leaned into wind. But between Talia and Juniper, something had shifted. Not safety like armor, but safety like a house with a key. She looked down at her hands, the rough knuckles, the faint scars, and then at Juniper, who hummed a tune she had taught her in the trailer. Talia tightened her grip on the steering wheel and, for the first time in a long time, felt the steadiness of a decision that was hers alone. Paper had not made everything right, but it had bought them air.